I want to add words of welcome to those that Dan already expressed. We're glad that you're here tonight. And as he mentioned, others have mentioned, we've had a perfect weather day. We couldn't ask for better. It's picture perfect. And a great way to end the day is to join together in worship to God. Thanks for being here on this Sunday night. And thanks to those who are visiting with us. We're glad that you've come to join us tonight. Please come back whenever you can. We're doing something unusual, a little different in recent Sunday nights, and we want to continue tonight. We're just trying to describe the Bible first to last. We're trying to go through the Bible timeline. Of course, initially we're working in the Old Testament to develop an understanding of the chronological events that occurred during the Old Testament. All of these stories fit together. It's a story about God's dealings with men, and especially about God's fulfilling of promises. And the ultimate promise that God had was that He was going to send a blessing to all of mankind through the seed of Abraham, and that blessing would be Jesus Christ. So these Old Testament, the historical events in the Old Testament lead up to the coming of Jesus Christ, and that's important history for us to know. And so we're just reviewing that in a very basic way. I remember back when I was a kid in school and they assigned us a book report. You had to write a book report, you know. If they allowed us to choose the book that we could read, I was always looking for one that had a Cliff Notes version. Some of you kids don't know what Cliff Notes are probably, but back in the day, Cliff Notes were a little brief summary of a much bigger book. And you could read the Cliff Notes in about a half an hour versus taking hours and days to read the regular book. So I was always looking for the Cliff Note edition if I had to write a book report. Well, this is sort of the Cliff Note edition, if you will, of the Old Testament story. And we're just sort of looking at the main events. That's what we're doing, but we're trying to put them together in chronological order. I want to do a quick review. Mitchell told me beforehand he'd give me a minute to do a review leading up to where we are. I don't think I can do it in a minute, but I'm going to go fast. I'm going to go really fast. I didn't go so fast last week. I'm going to go faster this week. The Old Testament story, of course, begins at the beginning. God created all things. First man and woman that He created were Adam and Eve. Their first two sons, Cain and Abel. And they gave us the early lesson about what acceptable worship is. The world was so wicked, He sent the flood in the days of Noah and spared only Noah and his family and the animals that were on the ark. After the flood, God scattered humankind across the globe by confounding their languages at the Tower of Babel. Beginning about chapter 12 of Genesis, the history narrows, and we follow the history of a man named Abraham. His wife was Sarah, his nephew was Lot, and the story of the Old Testament primarily follows the family and the descendants of this man Abraham. God made three promises, as we said to Abraham. His people would become a great nation. They would occupy a land. But ultimately, through his seed, would all nations of the earth be blessed. And that third promise is the best and most important one because it involves salvation through Jesus Christ, who was a descendant of this man Abraham. Abraham and Sarah didn't have an heir, though. It looked like there's going to be a problem. No heir to inherit these blessings. But God gave them a son in their old age. His name was Isaac. Abraham, his faith was tested. Now that the son has been born, God says sacrifice the son. Abraham was willing to do so. Stopped at the last minute, but willing to do so. Abraham's son Isaac had two sons, Jacob and Esau. Esau was the older, but he didn't cherish the things of the elder brother. He sold his birthright to Jacob for a bowl of soup. And later, Jacob deceived the father into receiving the family blessing. And so the storyline continues through Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons. The oldest was Reuben, the youngest was Benjamin, but his favorite was Joseph. Joseph was his favorite son, and his brothers hated him and were jealous of him and sold him as a slave into Egypt. But Joseph was really a great person. And he excelled in Egypt in several different situations, and ultimately, amazingly, from having been sold as a slave, was raised to number 2 in authority in all the land of Egypt. His brothers came, and they ultimately brought their father down there, and all the family moved to Egypt because of a great famine that was going on at the time. Everything went well for these children of Israel. Jacob's name was changed to Israel. These thus then are the children of Israel. Everything was going well until Joseph died. After Joseph died, it says a king arose who did not know Joseph. And so the Israelites then were forced into slavery in Egypt. And the burdens and oppression on them were very great. They were being oppressed so much so, and the Pharaoh was afraid that they were multiplying too rapidly. He said, kill all the boy babies. But one boy baby was spared, who was Moses. His mother floated him in a basket in the river. He was found by Pharaoh's daughter, raised in Pharaoh's household. But ultimately, he too had to flee from Egypt. He went into the land of Midian, and God spoke to him in a burning bush, said, go back to Pharaoh. Tell him to let my people go. Pharaoh was not inclined to do so. And so 10 plagues, 10 powerful plagues. God sent 10 plagues upon the Egyptians. The final, the 10th one, the worst one, was the death of all the firstborn in the land of Egypt. And the way that the children of Israel were spared from that is that they took the lamb of blood and painted it on their doorpost and the lintels of their house. And when death came upon the Egyptians, the Lord passed over the houses of the Israelites that were marked with this blood on the doorposts and lintels. The Passover, therefore, became an annual observance of the Israelites ever after that. When they were fleeing the land of Egypt, they got to the Red Sea. Pharaoh's army was pursuing behind them. How are they going to get across the Red Sea? Through God's power. Moses held forth his staff. The waters parted. They went through on dry land. When the Egyptians tried to follow, they were drowned in the waters. They traveled to Mount Sinai in the very southern tip of what we call the Sinai Peninsula. And there on Mount Sinai, God gave the law to Moses. Part of that law was inscribed on tables of stone, engraved with God's own finger. But when Moses came down from the mountain, the children of Israel had constructed an idol, a golden calf, and they were worshiping it. And Moses was so angry, he threw down the tables of stone, and the people were punished. They had become already unfaithful to God. Part of the law that God gave to Moses on the mountain was specifications for constructing a place of worship. It was called the tabernacle. Tabernacle means literally a tent. And this was a tent. And they could take it down and move it with them when they went from place to place. But the specifications were very elaborate. And you can tell that God really cared about the details. God is a God of details. When they got near the promised land, they sent spies in to spy it out. There were 12 spies, one from each of the tribes. They all came back and said it's a wonderful land, but 10 of the spies said the problem is we will never, ever be able to conquer it because the people are so great. However, Joshua and Caleb said, let's go. God will be with us. Let's go. But the people listened to the majority report. They rejected God's promise that they would inherit the land. And so they were punished for 40 years. They had to wander in the wilderness for 40 years until all of that generation died off. And the only ones from that generation that were ultimately able to go into the promised land were these two, Caleb and Joshua. When Moses was about to die, just before they were to enter into the promised land, he passed the leadership of Israel to Joshua, who had been like his right-hand man. They entered the promised land. The first city they came to was Jericho. By marching around the walls of the city and by following the instructions of God, the city was miraculously given to them. They ultimately ended up conquering all of that land, and it was divided up to the various tribes of Israel. Each had various territories. That's how far we've gotten. How long was that, Mitchell? That was, where is Mitchell? I don't see him back. That was more than a minute, wasn't it? A little more than a minute. It was pretty close, though. All right. So the land was divided up among the tribes. Joshua, at the end of Joshua's life, things were going fairly well. But then we enter into a period of the history of Israel called the period of the Judges. After they conquered the promised land, then came the period of time we call the period of the Judges. Look in the book of Judges in chapter 2, verse 1. It says, the angel of the Lord came up from Gilgal to Bochim, and he said, I brought you up out of Egypt and led you into the land which I have sworn to your fathers. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you. And as for you, you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall tear down their altars, but you have not obeyed me. What is this that you have done? Therefore I also said, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall become as a thorn in your sides, and their gods shall be a snare unto you. And so the children of Israel didn't fully drive out the previous occupants of the land of promise. Those people were pagans, and they were very into idolatrous worship. And God said, you shouldn't make a covenant with them. Their gods are going to become a snare to you. And the fact of the matter is that they did. Skip down to verse 11. Judges 2, verse 11. Then the sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. And they forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt, and followed other gods from among the gods of the people who were around them, and bowed themselves down to them. Thus they provoked the Lord to anger. So they forsook the Lord and served Baal and Ashtaroth. The anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he gave them into the hands of plunderers who plundered them, and he sold them into the hands of their enemies round about, so that they could no longer stand before their enemies. And so just not long after Joshua died, the problem was that the children of Israel had not fully removed the promised land of the previous pagan inhabitants. And now those pagans were influencing the children of Israel to worship their idols. Obviously, God is displeased. He says, therefore I'm going to let plunderers, I'm going to let oppressors, I'm going to let your enemies rule over you. And that is in fact what happened. And so a repeated history began. The children of Israel would fall away from faithfully serving God. When they saw their error and turned back to God, He would bring on a judge, one of the judges, to help them against their oppressors. Keep reading in verse 16. Judges 2, verse 16. Then the Lord raised up judges who delivered them from the hands of those who plundered them. And yet they did not listen to their judges, for they played the harlot after other gods and bowed themselves down to them. They turned aside quickly from the way in which their fathers had walked in obeying the commands of the Lord. They did not do as their fathers. And when the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge and delivered them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who oppressed and afflicted them. But it came about when the judge died that they would turn back and act more corruptly than their fathers, in following other gods to serve them and bow down to them. They did not abandon their practices or their stubborn ways. Do you see the problem here? A repeating history. God, because they were unfaithful, God would let them be oppressed. They'd cry out to God. God would send a judge to deliver them from their oppressors. But just about as soon as that was done, they'd turn back to other idols and become unfaithful again. This was a repeating history. There was a succession of judges. Depending on how you count the number of judges, there were 12 or 13. There's one there that some say shouldn't be counted and others say should be. 12 or 13 judges. And so this just went on and on and on. The period of time, this period of the judges was approximately 400 years. There's some difference about how long that period lasted, but about 400 years is probably a pretty good guess through the process of these 12 or 13 different judges. The first of the judges was a man named Othniel. And Othniel was actually a relative, a nephew, we think, of Caleb, one of the faithful spies, Joshua and Caleb. This first judge, Othniel, we think was a nephew of Caleb. Among the judges, there was a woman. The only woman judge was Deborah. She was one of the judges. One of the famous judges was Gideon. Gideon was apparently a rather timid fellow and was doubtful as to whether God's calling him into service was actually really what he should do. And you may remember that he asked God to give him a sign, the sign of the fleece. He asked him actually to do it twice. The first time he said, I'm going to put a fleece on the ground, and I want the fleece to be wet with dew and all the ground around it dry. God did that. He said, well, I really need another sign. He said, this time I want to put the fleece on the ground, and I want the ground to be wet all around, but the fleece to be dry, and God did that. Clearly indicating to Gideon, I want you to be the one who delivers Israel from these oppressors. He gathered an army, but the army was too large, and through a process of elimination, he got his fighting force down to just 300 men. Because God said, I want the people to know that I am the one who gave you deliverance, not by your own power or strength. And so Gideon and his 300 men were able to deliver Israel. One of the later judges was Samson. Samson's well known. Samson had long hair. He was a Nazirite from birth. He was a Nazirite. And one of the requirements of the Nazirite vow was to not cut the hair. And so he was a man of long hair. We remember his strength seemed to be embedded in that lengthy hair. Samson, though a judge of God, for God, was also a man who had some significant moral failings. Ultimately, you remember Delilah talked him into revealing the secret of his strength. She cut his hair off. He had no strength. The Philistines captured him. He was brought out for sport at one of their temple ceremonies, but they had forgotten to keep his hair short, and his hair had grown back some. And in a last burst of strength, he pushed down the pillars that held up the pagan temple. He died, and a lot of Philistines died with him. Near the very end of the period of Judges, the judge who was in office or doing the work at that time was this older man, Eli. And a young boy by the name of Samuel began to serve when he was a boy. You all remember his mother's name? His mother's name was Hannah. And so Hannah devoted her son Samuel to serve under the judge Eli, and Samuel would finally become the last judge of Israel. The people wanted to be like the nations around. This arrangement that God had for them just wasn't suiting them. They didn't like it. Look in 1 Samuel chapter 8. Now, you may notice as we keep looking at these various Bible references, we just keep moving through the Scripture, right? We just keep moving right on along. We're not going back. We're not going too far forward. We're just following the Bible story right along. And in 1 Samuel chapter 8, at verse 4, all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. And they said to him, Behold, you have grown old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king for us to judge us like all the nations. Get that? They wanted to be like the nations around them. They weren't content to do things the way God had planned for them. We want to be like the people around us. Through the years, I'm sure many sermons have been preached on this idea of we want to be like the people around us. That's not a good thing, right? Because the people around us are not God-fearing people. And when God's people want to be like the people around them, that's a bad thing. Now, keep reading there in verse 6. The thing was displeasing in the sight of Samuel when they said, Give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed to the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, Listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. And so Samuel was instructed to go ahead and appoint the first king over Israel. I know this picture that we have here, I've been asked before about that picture, is this is Samuel, and this is the first king, Saul. Someone said, what's he stabbing into his head there? He's actually not stabbing anything into his head. This is to represent a horn of oil. The way they anointed people would show that they were specially chosen was to anoint their head with oil. This is to represent Samuel anointing Saul as the first king over Israel. Everything was pretty good with Saul initially. He was successful. The nation of Israel prospered under his leadership. But ultimately, Saul, the first king, Saul failed because he disobeyed God. Look in 1 Samuel 13. 1 Samuel 13 at verse 13. 1 Samuel 13, verse 13. Samuel said to Saul, You have acted foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. For now the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not endure. The Lord has sought out for himself a man after his own heart. And the Lord has appointed him as ruler over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. And so Saul was not allowed to continue. His family did not become a kingly dynasty over Israel. He was the only one. And after him, the kingship went to someone else. God had chosen someone else. Well, this someone else we know was David. And we first know about David when he was just a shepherd boy. But he was chosen by God to be the next king. And his first act of bravery, and what he became famous for in Israel, and to this day, what he became famous for was killing the giant Goliath. The armies of Israel were engaged with the armies of the Philistines. And every day this giant of a guy, Goliath, would come out and he would taunt the armies of Israel. Send out your best warrior. Just he and I will fight. And whoever wins, that will determine the outcome of this whole thing. Send out your champion. The Israelites were shaking in their boots, literally, and they were unwilling to answer that challenge. David showed up at the battlefield, and he was alarmed that nobody had taken up the challenge. And he said, I will do so. Look in chapter 17, 1 Samuel 17, verse 32. David said to Saul, Saul is still king. David is the one who's going to be king. Saul said to David, you are not able to fight. You're not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him. For you are but a youth, while he has been a warrior from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant was tending his father's sheep when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock. And I went out after him and attacked him and rescued it from his mouth. And when he rose up against me, I seized him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, since he has taunted the armies of the living God. David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and may the Lord be with you. And the Lord was with him. And you remember, with a sling and a stone, he killed the giant Goliath. He became famous for that. Saul was ultimately subsequent to that, when David became very popular among the people, King Saul was jealous of him and pursued him and even tried to kill him because he was jealous that the people's affections had turned to David away from him, Saul. But ultimately Saul was killed in battle and David was made king. We read a lot about David, many episodes in the life of David. We can't cover them all. Sadly, one of the ones that he is most famous for, one of his greatest failings, and that's the story of David and Bathsheba. We remember that he took another man's wife. He actually had that man killed so he could have her as his wife. In 2 Samuel chapter 12, King David is confronted about this that he has done. 2 Samuel 12 verse 7. God's prophet Nathan came to David. And he told him a story about a rich man who had lots of herds and flocks. A guest came to his house. He didn't butcher one of his own animals. He went to a poor man's house who had just one ewe lamb, who was the family pet. And the rich man took the poor man's single lamb and slaughtered it to serve to his guest. When David heard that story, he was just mad as he could possibly be. He was angry. And then the prophet Nathan turned it and said, you are the man. Verse 7, 2 Samuel 12, verse 7. You are the man, says the Lord God of Israel. It is I who anointed you king over Israel, and it is I who delivered you from the hand of Saul. I also gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your care, and I gave you the house of Israel and Judah. And if that had been too little, I would have added to you many more things like these. Why have you despised the word of the Lord by doing evil in his sight? You have struck down Uriah the Hittite with a sword, have taken his wife to be your wife, and have killed him with the sword of the sons of Ammon. Now therefore the sword shall never depart from your house, because you have despised me and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. So Nathan the prophet bravely confronts King David with his sin. And we've always been so impressed with the humble response of David. David did not have to take this sitting down. He's the king. He has power. He can order that this man Nathan be killed on the spot. But instead he humbly says in verse 13, David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. He didn't try to justify it. He didn't try to explain it away. He just simply acknowledged that he was guilty. He had sinned. And it's so sad that one of the most remembered episodes of this great man David is the sin that he committed with Bathsheba. His son Solomon became the next king. Look in 1 Kings 3. In 1 Kings chapter 3, beginning in verse 5, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream at night and said to him, "Ask what you wish me to give you." That's pretty interesting, isn't it? You know, sometimes we have the idea, if I could just have one wish, what I'd wish for, man. And I'd wish for great wealth or whatever. Here's a case where Solomon was offered a wish, and it could have been true, anything that he desired. But notice what he said in verse 8. "If thy servant is in the midst of thy people, which thou hast chosen, a great people who cannot be numbered or counted in multitude, so give thy servant an understanding heart to judge thy people, to discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of thine?" And so instead of asking for riches, and instead of asking for vengeance against his enemies, Solomon asked for wisdom to rule the people. That request pleased God. And in verse 8, skipping on down in verse 10, I'm in 1 Kings 3, verse 10. "It was pleasing in the sight of the Lord that Solomon had asked this thing. And God said to him, because you have asked this thing and have not asked for yourself long life, nor have asked riches for yourself, nor have asked for the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself discernment to understand justice, behold, I have done according to your words. Behold, I have given you a wise and discerning heart, so that there has been no one like you before you, nor shall one like you arise after you. And I have also given you what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that there will not be any among the kings like you all your days." And so Solomon, David's son, became the third king over Israel. First Saul, then David, then Solomon was king over Israel. He was famous. He became very famous for his wisdom that he asked for, but also for his great wealth, which, guys, I'm going to give you that too, because you were good to ask for wisdom. I'm going to give you wealth. In fact, he was so wealthy that the Queen of Sheba came to see him in chapter 10. Now, in 1 Kings chapter 10, at verse 6, she said to the king, "It was a true report which I heard in mine own land about your words and your wisdom. Nevertheless, I did not believe the reports until I came and my eyes had seen it. And behold, the half was not told me. You exceed in wisdom and prosperity the report which I heard." The half has not been told, sort of a famous expression. And it was the Queen of Sheba who said that about Solomon. This picture which we have on the screen was one of the famous early indications of the wisdom of Solomon. You remember this episode? Two women who had children had been together in the house. During the night, one of the mothers had smothered her own baby, so she took her dead baby and put it in the place of the other and took the live baby to herself. In the morning, there was a great conflict. Whose baby was dead and whose baby was alive, and they brought this situation before King Solomon. Now, what are you going to do there? I mean, how are you going to know whose baby is whose? This woman says the live baby is mine, the dead baby is hers. The other woman said, no, it's the other way around. How are you going to decide? I don't know, that's pretty tough. I don't know how you're going to decide that. Solomon said, okay, bring a sword and cut the living baby in half and give half to each one. Well, someone said, how in the world is that going to solve anything? Solomon knew in his wisdom the true mother of the child will not want it to be killed. And so immediately the mother spoke up, no, don't do that. And Solomon knew that that was the true mother of the child. And that was just one instance of the great wisdom of Solomon. Solomon wrote in our Bibles many of the Proverbs that we read in the book of Proverbs. He was a wise man. One of the things that he was famous for was the construction of the temple in Jerusalem. The temple in Jerusalem became the replacement for that elaborate tent, that tabernacle where they had been worshiping before. Solomon built the temple in Jerusalem, and it was fabulous. Just completely overladen with gold and precious things. It was very special in the city of Jerusalem. Unfortunately, Solomon was not faithful in the later days of his life. Look in chapter 11. 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 3. He had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned his heart away. For it came about when Solomon was old that his wives turned his heart away after other gods, and his heart was not wholly devoted to the Lord his God as the heart of David his father had been. Sort of a sad footnote in the life of Solomon. We've got just a few minutes left. Let's go just a little bit further. And if we get just a little bit further, I think we can wrap this Old Testament story up next week, Lord willing. After Solomon's death, his son Rehoboam, Solomon's son Rehoboam, would have been the king, but the people made an early request of him. In chapter 12, 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 3, they sent and called him, and Jeroboam and all the assembly of Israel came and spoke to Rehoboam, saying, Your father made our yoke hard, therefore lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke which he put on us, and we will serve you. They basically, the way we would put that, he said, your dad just about taxed us to death. And if you could lighten up the load on us a little, we'll serve you faithfully as we served him. But we need some relief. So Solomon asked counsel of the older men around him. Then he asked counsel of the younger men around. The older men said, yeah, you should do what they're asking. The younger men said, no, make it harder even yet. And Rehoboam followed the advice of the younger counselors. Notice in verse 13, the king answered the people harshly, for he forsook the advice of the elders which they had given him, and he spoke to them according to the advice of the young men, saying, My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. He said, I'm going to make it harder yet. And that was it. That broke it. And in verse 16 it says, when all Israel saw that the king did not listen to them, the people answered the king, saying, What portion do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the sons of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. Now look after your own house, David. So Israel departed to their tents. But as for the sons of Israel who lived in the cities of Judah, Rehoboam reigned over them. And so the nation was split. Jeroboam was sort of the man who had been their spokesperson, and he took the majority of the tribes and left. Only in the south, where the tribe of Judah was predominant, only there did Solomon's son Rehoboam continue to reign. Jeroboam reigned over what we know as the northern kingdom, and they continued to use the name Israel. The southern kingdom would be known as Judah. All right, now I want to do something just a little bit different in our progression here. Now I want to sort of split our study. First of all, I want us to study what happened in the north. We're going to come back. We're going to backtrack a little bit just a little later to talk about what happened in the south, in Judah. But let's talk just briefly about what happened in the north. The people of the north had a perpetual problem. It was from the very start, and they never gave it up, and it was the worship of idols. Look in chapter 12, still in chapter 12, 1 Kings chapter 12, at verse 26. Jeroboam built Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and lived there, and he went out from there and built Penuel. And Jeroboam said in his heart, Now the kingdom will return to the house of David. If this people go up to offer sacrifices in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, then the heart of the people will return to their Lord, even to Jeroboam king of Judah, and they will kill me and return to Rehoboam king of Judah. So the king consulted and made 2 golden calves, and he said to them, It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Behold your gods, O Israel, that brought you up from the land of Egypt. And he set one in Dan, and the other he set one in Bethel, and the other he put in Dan. Now this thing became a sin, for the people went to worship before the one as far as Dan. And so all kinds of idols. This initial one was a golden calf, but other idols are obviously a distraction and a sin to the northern kingdom of Israel. They had a series of bad kings. The kings of the northern kingdom were just bad kings. They had a series of horrible kings. The worst of them, famous, you know his name, the worst of the kings of Israel was Ahab. Chapter 16. Look in chapter 16, verse 30. And Ahab, the son of Omri, did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him. And it came about as though it had been a trivial thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, that he married Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of Sidonians, and went to serve Baal and worshipped him. And so Ahab was a very bad king among a succession of bad kings. His wife Jezebel, famous, but his wife Jezebel made him even worse. The prophet of God in that time was a powerful man named Elijah. And he led a famous confrontation with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. Look in chapter 18. You know this story well, I think. In chapter 18, verse 22, Elijah said to the people, I alone am left a prophet of the Lord, but Baal's prophets are 450 men. Now let them give us 2 oxen. Let them choose one for themselves and cut it up and place it on the wood, but put no fire under it. And I will prepare the other ox and lay it on the wood, and I will put no fire under it. Then you call in the name of your God, and I will call in the name of the Lord. And the God who answers by fire, He is God. And the people answered and said, that's a good idea. And so that was what was done. The prophets of Baal, of course, could produce no fire. Verse 26, they took the ox which was given them, they prepared it and called on the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, O Baal, answer us. But there was no voice, and no one answered. And they leaped about the altar which they had made. And it came about at noon that Elijah mocked them and said, call out with a loud voice, for he is a God. Either he's occupied or gone aside, or he's on a journey, or perhaps he's asleep and needs to be awakened. So they cried with a loud voice and cut themselves according to their custom with swords and lances until the blood gushed out upon them. No fire from Baal. Baal's not a true God, right? He's just an idol. But then it says in verse 33, Elijah arranged the wood and cut the ox in pieces and laid it on the wood. And he said, fill 4 pitchers with water and pour it on the burnt offering and on the wood. He said, do it a second time. They did it a second time. He said, do it a third time. They did it a third time. And the water flowed around the altar. He also filled the trench which was around the altar with water. It came about at the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice that Elijah the prophet came near and said, O Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, today let it be known that thou art God in Israel, and that I am thy servant, and that I have done all these things at thy word. Answer me, O Lord. He says, and verse 38 says, the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering and the wood and the stones and the dust and licked up the water that was in the trench. Elijah, with the famous confrontation with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, proving, of course, that the one God of heaven is the true God. When Elijah was about to be taken away, Elijah didn't experience physical death. He was transported away by God. And before he went, he passed his work of prophet on to another man with a similar name. Elijah passed his work on to Elisha. Elisha was a prophet of God, and his fame sort of was concerning a number of really unique miracles that were done at his hand, Elisha. Finally, the northern kingdom was taken away into captivity because of their continuing unfaithfulness, their evil, their idol worship. They were taken away into captivity by the Assyrian Empire. In 2 Kings chapter 17, and we'll end here, 2 Kings chapter 17 at verse 22, the sons of Israel walked in all the sins of Jeroboam, which he did. They did not depart from them. That is, they just continued to worship idols. Until the Lord removed Israel from his sight, as he spoke through all his servants the prophets. So Israel was carried away into exile from their own land to Assyria until this day. And so ultimately, the northern kingdom was carried away into captivity by the Assyrians. They never returned as a whole. There were, subsequent to this, there would be references to a few who came from those northern tribes, but they never came back as a whole, and they never reoccupied their land as a nation. And sometimes, even to this day, we call them the 10 lost tribes of Israel, because they were taken away in captivity because of their unfaithfulness. Let's see here. I meant to shut that off. You can go ahead and shut that off. James, thank you. That's the story through the divided kingdom and up to the end of the northern kingdom of Israel. It's a neat story, and it fits together just like it's almost like a novel or a story that you might read, a long history of people with lots of interesting individual episodes in the lives of these people. God's hand was in it all as God was working with these people. And again, the main thing was ultimately through these people would come the promised Messiah, Jesus. Thanks for your good attention to what we had to say. Went a little bit longer tonight than I intended, but thanks for following along carefully. We're going to continue this, maybe Lord willing, be able to wrap it up next Sunday evening with our Old Testament storyline. Several of you have expressed that you have enjoyed these studies and appreciate them, and I'm glad for that. I don't want to weary you with this, but it is a neat story, and I think you agree. We're going to end with a song of invitation. If you need help making your life right with God, whatever that need may be, let us know while we stand and sing this song.
Sometimes the shadows are to be and run.
The number is number 367. Okay.
Oh, sometimes the shadows are to be and run. Seems like to the Lord, and sorrow